Somewhere around 5,000 years ago in the marshy floodplain where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers empty into the Persian Gulf, a group of people did something no human beings had ever done before. They built the first cities. They invented writing. They created the first law codes, the first epic poetry, the first organized irrigation systems, the first standing armies, the first bureaucracies keeping track of grain and taxes on clay tablets that are still legible today, 5 millennia later. We call them the Sumerians, and by any reasonable measure, they are the founders of civilization itself. Thy people, every single city, every government, every written word on earth ultimately traces back to in one way or another. Consider just how much of what surrounds you right now, in whatever moment you're watching this, actually descends from decisions made in those Sumerian mud brick cities 5,000 years ago. The 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle both come from the Sumerian base 60 counting system. The idea of codified written law rules a ruler couldn't simply overrule on a whim because they were carved permanently into stone or pressed into clay traces back to Sumerian legal texts predating Hammurabi's more famous Babylonian code by centuries. Even the basic concept of a city, a permanent settlement large enough to require specialized labor, formal government, and organized food distribution for people who no longer grew their own grain, was, as far as the archaeological record shows, first worked out by Sumerian communities in the marshes of southern Iraq. And then, within a few centuries, they were gone. Absorbed, historians used to say, swallowed into the later Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires that rose up around and eventually over them, their language falling silent, spoken by nobody, existing only in cuneiform inscriptions that took modern scholars over a century to even learn to read again. For most of the 20th century, that was where the Sumerian story simply stopped, a people who changed the world and then vanished so completely that we couldn't even say for certain where they had originally come from or where their descendants ultimately ended up. But in the last few years, a new kind of evidence has started reaching back into that silence, not clay tablets, not ruins, but DNA, extracted directly from human remains buried in the same river valley the Sumerians once called home. And what it's revealing is forcing historians to rethink one of the oldest unsolved questions in the story of human civilization. Before we get into the genetics, you have to understand just how strange the Sumerian mystery already was, purely from a linguistic standpoint, because this is the detail that made the question of Sumerian origins so maddening for so long. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it doesn't clearly belong to any known language family. It isn't Semitic, like the Akkadian language that eventually replaced it in daily use, and it isn't Indo-European, like the languages that would later sweep across much of Eurasia. It simply sits there in the historical record related to nothing else. Scholars have ever been able to confidently connect it to a linguistic island in the middle of the world's first great civilization. To put that in perspective, almost every other ancient language we know of can be slotted into some kind of family tree, some web of shared vocabulary and grammar connecting it to relatives near and far, the way English connects to German and Dutch, or the way Akkadian itself connects to Hebrew and Arabic through the shared Semitic family. Sumerian has no such relatives, dead or alive, anywhere on Earth. Generations of linguists have proposed connections to languages as far-flung as the Dravidian languages of southern India, various Caucasian language families, and even, more speculatively, distant relationships to languages in Central Asia, and none of these proposals have ever gathered enough solid evidence to become anything close to consensus. It remains, to this day, one of history's most stubborn linguistic dead ends. For over a century, that isolation fueled endless speculation about who the Sumerians actually were and where they'd come from, migrants from the Iranian plateau, seafarers from somewhere further east, or a population that had simply always been there, indigenous to the marshlands with a language that had evolved in place with no close relatives because no close relatives existed anymore to compare it to. Written records and archaeology alone couldn't settle the question. They could tell you what the Sumerians built, wrote, and believed, but not where their ancestors' genes had actually come from, or where their descendants' genes eventually went. Getting that genetic evidence turned out to be brutally difficult, and understanding why matters just as much as understanding what researchers eventually found. Ancient DNA survives best in cold, dry, stable environments, which is exactly why so much of the groundbreaking ancient DNA research of the last 2 decades has come out of Northern Europe and Siberia. Places where permafrost and consistently cool temperatures preserve genetic material for tens of thousands of years. Mesopotamia. A is almost the opposite of that ideal environment. Hot, arid summers baking the ground, seasonal flooding from the Tigris and Euphrates, millennia of continuous human occupation, disturbing and redisturbing burial sites, all of it works against DNA preservation. For years, researchers openly described the ancient DNA record from Mesopotamia and the wider Fertile Crescent as frustratingly sparse compared to almost anywhere else archaeologists had turned their attention, which is exactly why the studies that have managed to pull usable ancient DNA from this region in recent years carry outsized scientific weight. Every single genome recovered represents a genuine technical achievement squeezed out of some of the worst possible preservation conditions on the planet. The process itself is painstaking in a way that's easy to underestimate from the outside. Researchers typically extract genetic material from the dense petrous bone at the base of the skull or from tooth roots, structures that offer slightly better protection for fragile ancient DNA molecules than other bones, then work in specialized clean lab facilities specifically designed to prevent modern DNA, including the researcher's own, from contaminating samples that may contain only tiny, degraded fragments of genuine ancient genetic material. A single successful ancient genome from a hot, arid region like Mesopotamia can represent months of laboratory work, and a significant percentage of samples attempted from this region simply fail to yield usable DNA at all, which is exactly why the studies that have succeeded carry as much scientific weight as they do within the field. One of the most significant of these studies focused on a site called Bakr Awa, one of the largest ancient settlements in northeastern Iraq, sitting almost precisely on the border between ancient Mesopotamia and the Zagros mountain region of Iran. Researchers sequenced DNA from 17 individuals spanning the Bronze Age and Iron Age, published through Genome Biology, and what they found upended a simpler picture of regional population history that earlier, smaller studies had suggested. Going back further to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, earlier published genomes from a nearby site called Bestansur showed a population with a fairly close, relatively uniform genetic affinity to the central Zagros mountain region, a locally rooted farming population without much evidence of outside genetic influence. But by the time you reach the Bronze Age at Bakr Awa, that picture had transformed completely. The genome-wide data reveals substantial genetic heterogeneity, meaning real, measurable diversity, with clear influences from Anatolian populations to the north and west, Levantine populations from the Mediterranean coast, and even Caucasus and Yamnaya-related ancestry, the genetic signature associated with the steppe populations who, in other parts of Eurasia, around this same era, were driving some of the most consequential migrations in human prehistory. In other words, sometime between the earliest farming communities and the rise of full Bronze Age urban civilization, this corner of the Mesopotamian world stopped being a relatively closed, locally descended population and became a genuine crossroads, absorbing genetic input from multiple directions at once. One individual from that Bronze Age sample deserves special attention because his data tells an almost novelistic little story all on its own. Researchers found that this particular man carried Yamnaya-related Caucasus ancestry, showing up clearly both in his Y-chromosome and across his broader genome-wide signature, exactly the kind of genetic marker you would expect from someone whose paternal line traced back toward the Caucasus steppe migrations. But then the researchers ran a separate, completely independent kind of analysis, stable isotope testing on his tooth enamel, which can reveal information about the water and food a person consumed, specifically during childhood, effectively fingerprinting where someone actually grew up regardless of what their DNA says about deep ancestry. And the isotope data told a different, more immediate story. It suggested this man had spent his own childhood not in the Caucasus at all, but much closer to home, in the Zagros mountain region, meaning he wasn't a first-generation migrant himself, freshly arrived from the steppe. He was, more likely, a descendant of that Caucasus-related migration, born and raised locally, carrying the genetic legacy of ancestors who'd made that journey possibly generations before he was ever born, fully integrated into a local population by the time he was old enough to leave his own biological fingerprint in the historical record. It's a small detail, but it's exactly the kind of nuance ancient DNA can capture that written history simply cannot. The difference between a single dramatic migration event and a slower multi-generational process of settlement and integration playing out in one specific person's bones. Then comes the Iron Age layer of the same Bakr Awa dataset, and this is where the study's most important overall conclusion comes into focus. If Mesopotamia had experienced some kind of dramatic population replacement between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the kind of event that shows up constantly elsewhere in ancient DNA studies across Eurasia during the same broad era, you'd expect to see it clearly in the genomes, a sharp genetic break between the two periods. That's not what the data shows. Instead, the Iron Age individuals at Bakr Awa appear to largely descend from the preceding Bronze Age community, their ancestry reflecting a genuine integration of the population structure that had already been established, rather than replacement by some entirely new incoming group. The site itself was abandoned and later resettled, but the people doing the resettling weren't strangers arriving from nowhere. They were, genetically speaking, continuous with the people who'd lived there before. That finding directly complicates the old, simpler narrative of Mesopotamian history as a story of waves, one group conquering and displacing another, Sumerian giving way to Akkadian, giving way to Babylonian, giving way to Assyrian, each supposedly bringing an entirely new population with it. The genetics instead paint a picture of ongoing accumulation and integration, successive cultural and political changes layered on top of a genetically continuous, steadily diversifying regional population, rather than each new era representing a fresh genetic start. This matters enormously for how we understand the Sumerian collapse specifically, because the traditional narrative, Sumerians conquered and culturally absorbed by Akkadian speakers, then later Babylonian and Assyrian powers, always carried an implicit assumption that each political transition brought a wave of genetically distinct newcomers with it, gradually diluting or replacing whatever the original Sumerian population had been. The Bakr Awa data suggests a more nuanced reality, at least for this particular corner of Mesopotamia, one where political and linguistic change could sweep through a region far more dramatically and rapidly than the underlying population itself actually changed. Sumerian, the language, may have gone silent, but the people who once spoke it, or their direct genetic descendants, likely didn't vanish so much as they were gradually absorbed into new political structures, new languages, and new cultural identities, while their genetic lineage carried on largely uninterrupted beneath the surface of those changes, generation folding into generation, long after anyone remembered which of their ancestors had once called themselves Sumerian at all. A separate line of ancient DNA research adds an even stranger thread to this story, one that involves maternal lineages recovered from sites along the Middle Euphrates Valley, Syria, at locations known in antiquity as Terka and Karas or Nasirpal. Researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA from human remains spanning an enormous window of time, from the early Bronze Age all the way through the Roman period, roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era through the early centuries after it. Among the maternal lineages they identified were haplogroups classified as M4B1, M49, and M61, genetic markers that population geneticists believe originated on the Indian subcontinent during the Upper Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years ago, and which today are found concentrated specifically in populations across Tibet, the Himalayas, India, and Pakistan. Here's the genuinely startling part. These specific maternal lineages are essentially absent in people living in Syria today. Not rare, not unusual, but effectively gone, leaving no detectable trace in the modern population of the exact region where ancient DNA just proved they once existed. Researchers studying this connection have proposed a few possible explanations. Descendants of extremely long-distance ancient migrants who settled permanently in Mesopotamia and whose lineage simply didn't survive into the modern era through the specific maternal line ancient DNA tracks. Or, alternatively, traders and merchants moving along trade routes stretching between South Asia and the Fertile Crescent, leaving genetic traces behind in births that occurred along the way without necessarily representing permanent large-scale settlement. Either way, it's a genuine secret that only ancient DNA could have uncovered. A genetic connection stretching across thousands of miles and thousands of years that left absolutely no trace anywhere in the written record and no trace in anyone living in the region today. Visible now only because scientists managed to pull usable genetic material directly out of teeth buried for over 2,000 years. Consider also how differently this same story would have to be told without ancient DNA in the picture at all. Historians working purely from Syrian cuneiform tablets, trade ledgers, and archaeological artifacts along the Euphrates had already suspected long-distance trade connections stretching toward South Asia, based on things like the presence of certain traded goods and materials that don't naturally occur anywhere near Mesopotamia. But suspecting a trade connection and proving an actual biological, genealogical link between specific human beings living in these two regions are two entirely different categories of evidence. Ancient DNA is one of the only tools capable of closing that gap, turning a plausible trade route hypothesis into a confirmed genealogical fact. And it's exactly this kind of upgrade, from inference to direct evidence, that has made ancient DNA research one of the most consequential new tools in the entire field of archaeology over the past 2 decades. It's worth dwelling on just how improbable a finding this really is, because mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively along the maternal line, mother to daughter, an unbroken chain that has to survive completely intact for a lineage to still be detectable at all. For these specific South Asian associated haplogroups to show up in the Middle Euphrates Valley, that all means that, at minimum, one woman carrying that lineage lived, had at least one daughter, and that daughter's line continued long enough to Nasirpal, meaning a genuine, permanent settlement, rather than a single passing visitor. Whether that woman herself made an extraordinary journey from the Indian several generations removed from ancestors who had the researchers analyzing the data can't say for certain from mitochondrial evidence alone. What they can say is that some genuine biological thread connected two of the ancient world's great population centers, thousands of miles apart, long before anyone had written down a word about trade routes connecting South Asia to Mesopotamia, and that thread has since gone completely extinct in the modern population of the exact same region, surviving nowhere except in the ancient bones themselves. There's one more population worth bringing into this story because it connects the ancient genetic record directly to people alive in Iraq right now. In the marshlands of southern Iraq, precisely the region ancient Sumer once occupied, lives a population known as the Marsh Arabs, a community popular tradition has long associated with the strongest surviving link to the ancient Sumerians themselves, though that popular association has also faced real skepticism from some historians who've argued the Marsh Arabs might represent a more recent population, tied instead to the later introduction of water buffalo herding into the region. Researchers set out to test that question directly using Y-chromosome and mitochondrial DNA sampled from 143 Marsh Arab individuals, compared against a broader sample of Iraqi controls. What they found offered genuine, if partial, support for the older popular tradition. The Y-chromosome data revealed a specific genetic lineage, technically labeled J1As page 08, showing clear evidence of local population expansion timed almost precisely to the era of the Sumerian city-state period in southern Mesopotamia, a genetic growth signature lining up with exactly the centuries when Sumerian civilization was at its height. Layered underneath that more recent expansion, researchers also detected an older, more ancient genetic background shared specifically with populations from northern Mesopotamia, suggesting a deeper history of connection to the wider region stretching back even further than the Sumerian era itself. And the study found something else worth noting, a more pronounced genetic uniformity among Marsh Arab men compared to Marsh Arab women, a pattern researchers attribute to specific social and cultural factors, patrilocal living, arrangements where wives moved to join their husband's community, historical polygamy, and unequal rates of male versus female migration into and out of the population over many centuries, all of which leave distinctly different fingerprints on the paternal and maternal genetic lines, respectively. It's worth noting that this doesn't settle the older academic debate entirely in either direction, and honest researchers studying the Marsh Arabs have been careful about that. Finding a Y-chromosome expansion timed to the Sumerian era is genuinely striking evidence of deep continuity in this specific population, but it doesn't rule out later additions to the gene pool either, including the water buffalo herding population some historians have pointed to as more recent arrivals. The most accurate way to describe the genetic picture is probably the same layered story we've seen everywhere else in this investigation. An ancient core population with real, measurable roots stretching back to the Sumerian era itself, with additional genetic contributions folded in over the many centuries since, rather than either extreme, pure, unbroken Sumerian descent on one hand, or a population entirely unrelated to ancient Sumer on the other. So what does all of this actually add up to, and what's the honest, responsible way to describe what ancient DNA has and hasn't actually confirmed about the Sumerians specifically? It's important to be precise here, because no research team has yet recovered and definitively identified ancient DNA from a burial confirmed through inscription or unambiguous archaeological context to be an ethnic Sumerian individual by name, from a classic Sumerian era site like Uruk or Eridu, sequenced and published as such. The genomes we do have come from the surrounding region and overlapping and adjacent time periods. Bakr Awa, near the Zagros border, the Euphrates Valley sites in Syria, and the modern Marsh Arab population living directly in Sumer's old territory today, painting a picture around the edges of the Sumerian story rather than a single, definitive genetic snapshot of the Sumerians themselves. That's not a weakness in the science. It's simply where the field honestly stands right now, constrained by exactly the preservation challenges we talked about earlier, and it's likely to keep changing as new excavations and new sequencing techniques continue pushing into this notoriously difficult region. Researchers working on ancient Near Eastern genomes have been explicit about treating every recovered individual with real historical and ethical seriousness, describing their approach as one aimed at writing about these ancient people respectfully, as real individuals whose memories deserve care rather than simply as data points feeding a headline. That's worth keeping in mind here too, because it's tempting, especially with a topic this dramatic, to reach for tidier, more ongoing scientific detective story, still very much in progress, rather than a mystery that's already been definitively solved. But even with that honest caveat sitting front and center, the emerging picture is genuinely remarkable, and it converges from multiple independent directions on the same basic story. The world's first civilization did not emerge from a single, isolated, genetically uniform population quietly evolving in place with no outside contact. It emerged in a genuine crossroads, a region absorbing genetic influence from the Caucasus, from Anatolia, from the Levant, and carrying at least faint ancient echoes of contact, stretching as far as the Indian subcontinent, all layered onto a local population that itself shows real continuity and integration across the very centuries when Sumerian civilization rose, transformed, and eventually gave way to the empires that followed it. A civilization built at a genetic crossroads, speaking a language that fits into no known family tree, in the exact same river valley where farming, writing, and cities were all independently invented for the first time in human history. Maybe that's not entirely a coincidence. Diverse populations in close, sustained contact are exactly the conditions anthropologists have long associated with rapid cultural innovation, different traditionist techniques and ideas colliding and cross-pollinating in ways that a more isolated, homogeneous population simply doesn't experience in the same way. It doesn't prove why Sumerian civilization happened where and when it did, but it adds a genuinely compelling new layer to a 5,000-year-old question, one written not in cuneiform, but in the DNA quietly preserved against extraordinary odds in the ground beneath the very cities the Sumerians themselves once built.